To her left sat the court reporter, Angela, a woman in her 50s whose fingers flew across her stenography machine with the rhythm of someone who'd been doing this for 3 decades. She'd learned to tune out most of what happened in court, treating the words as just sounds to be transcribed, but every so often something would catch her attention and remind her that these weren't just cases, they were people's lives playing out in real time. To the judge's right stood Bailiff Thompson, a former police officer whose presence was meant to intimidate just enough to keep order. He stood with his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes scanning the courtroom with the practiced awareness of someone trained to spot trouble before it started. The microphone system in Courtroom 4B was old, installed sometime in the early 2000s when the county had received a grant to modernize the courts. There was a microphone on the judge's bench, one at the witness stand, one at the prosecution's table, and one at the defendant's table. They were supposed to pick up testimony for the court reporter and for the recording system that documented every hearing. What most people didn't realize was that all the microphones were on all the time, feeding into the overhead speakers so that everyone in the courtroom could hear clearly. It was designed for accessibility, to help those in the back of the gallery follow the proceedings, but it also meant that anything said near a microphone, even a whisper, could be broadcast to the entire room. Signs were posted, small placards that read, "Microphones active, all conversation may be recorded," but most people never noticed them, and even fewer understood what they really meant. Karen's case was number 17 on the docket that afternoon, which meant she'd been sitting in the uncomfortable wooden chair for nearly 90 minutes, watching other people's problems play out before hers. She'd seen a college kid get his marijuana possession charge reduced to a fine, a middle-aged man argue unsuccessfully about a parking ticket, and a woman cry while explaining why she'd been caught shoplifting diapers. Each case blurred into the next, a parade of people who, like her, had found themselves on the wrong side of a system that felt impersonal and uncaring. Her frustration had been building with each passing case, watching Judge Martinez dispense what looked like arbitrary decisions, sometimes lenient, sometimes harsh, with no pattern that Karen could discern. When the judge had made a joke at the expense of one defendant, the gallery had laughed, but Karen had felt her jaw clench. When she'd lectured another about personal responsibility, Karen had felt her hands ball into fists. By the time the clerk called, case number 2024, TRF 8847, State vs. Karen Mitchell, she was already angry, already convinced that whatever happened next wouldn't be fair. She stood, her legs unsteady from sitting too long, and approached the defendant's table where Marcus was already waiting. Judge Martinez looked down at the file in front of her, then looked up at Karen over her reading glasses. "Ms. Mitchell," she began, her voice carrying that tone of practiced patience that teachers use with difficult students, "you're here today regarding a speeding violation from January 14th, where you were clocked doing 62 in a 45 zone. You failed to pay the citation, failed to appear at your first court date, and now you're requesting a reduction or dismissal. Is that correct?" Karen nodded, and Marcus quickly whispered, "Say yes, Your Honor." She cleared her throat and said, "Yes, Your Honor," but the words felt bitter in her mouth. The judge continued, flipping through the paperwork. "I see you have a history of traffic violations. 3 speeding tickets in the last 5 years, 1 failure to yield, and 2 parking citations. Ms. Mitchell, the pattern here suggests a disregard for traffic laws." That phrase, disregard for traffic laws, hit Karen like a slap. She wanted to scream that she wasn't some reckless driver, that she was just trying to survive, that every one of those tickets had a reason behind it, that the system was designed to punish people who were already struggling. But Marcus had told her to stay quiet, so she bit her tongue and felt the heat rising in her chest. Judge Martinez asked her attorney to present his argument, and Marcus did his best, explaining Karen's financial hardship, her responsibilities as a single mother, her otherwise clean record aside from traffic issues. The judge listened, but her expression remained neutral, unreadable. When Marcus finished, Judge Martinez turned to the prosecutor, a young woman from the district attorney's office who argued that financial hardship wasn't an excuse for breaking the law and that reducing the fine would set a bad precedent. The prosecutor's voice was professional, detached, treating Karen's life like it was just another item on a checklist. Judge Martinez removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, a gesture Karen would later realize meant the judge was actually thinking carefully, but in that moment, it looked like dismissiveness, like she was already tired of dealing with this. "Ms. Mitchell," the judge said, "I understand that you're struggling financially. Many people who come through this courtroom are. But the law exists for a reason. Speed limits aren't suggestions. They're there to keep people safe. When you choose to exceed them, you're not just putting yourself at risk, you're putting others at risk too." Karen felt her attorney's hand touch her arm gently, a reminder to stay calm, but every word the judge spoke felt like another nail in a coffin that was already built for her. The judge continued, "I'm inclined to maintain the fine but offer you a payment plan. $50 a month until the full amount is paid, plus court costs. Does that seem manageable? $50 a month." Karen did the math instantly in her head. The original fine was $350. Court costs would add another $150. $500 total. At $50 a month, that was 10 months of payments, 10 months of scraping together money she didn't have, 10 months of choosing between this or groceries, this or her electric bill, this or her daughter's field trip. Her throat tightened, and she felt tears threatening, but she refused to cry, refused to give this judge the satisfaction of seeing her break. Marcus whispered, "It's a good deal. Say yes." But it didn't feel like a good deal. It felt like drowning in slow motion. She forced herself to nod and said quietly, "Yes, Your Honor." The judge made a note in the file and was about to move on to the next case when Karen felt something inside her snap, just a little, just enough. She leaned toward Marcus, her face turned slightly away from the microphone she didn't even remember was there, and in what she thought was a private whisper, she said, "This crazy judge doesn't understand anything. She's probably never missed a meal in her life. Easy to preach about responsibility when you've never had to choose between gas and groceries." The words came out bitter, dripping with frustration and exhaustion and years of feeling invisible to people in power. She expected Marcus to hear them and maybe give her a sympathetic look or tell her to be quiet. What she didn't expect was for Angela the court reporter to suddenly stop typing mid-sentence. What she didn't expect was for Bailiff Thompson's eyes to go wide. What she didn't expect was for every single person in the gallery to turn and stare at her with expressions ranging from shock to horror to barely suppressed amusement. What she didn't expect was for Marcus to turn pale and grip her arm hard enough to hurt. Because what Karen Mitchell didn't know in that moment was that her whisper hadn't been private at all. The microphone at the defendant's table had picked up every single word, and the speakers mounted in the corners of courtroom 4B had broadcast her comment to everyone present, crystal clear, impossible to miss. The entire room had just heard her call Judge Judith Martinez crazy. They'd heard her insult the judge's understanding, her life experience, her authority. And now, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, as Karen's eyes went from confused to terrified, as she realized from everyone's faces that something had gone terribly wrong, the courtroom fell into a silence so complete that you could hear the air conditioning rattle in the vents. Judge Martinez had frozen mid-reach for the next file. Her hand hovered in the air, her expression unreadable behind those reading glasses. Slowly, deliberately, she set her pen down on the bench. She removed her glasses and looked directly at Karen Mitchell, and in that look was something that made Karen's blood run cold. This wasn't anger, not yet. This was the moment before a storm, the quiet before thunder, the pause before everything changes. And Karen knew, with absolute certainty, that she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Karen Mitchell's life had been a series of near misses and close calls for as long as she could remember, but nothing had prepared her for the sensation of 30 pairs of eyes burning into her back while a judge who held her fate in her hand stared her down from the bench. The silence in courtroom 4B stretched on, seconds feeling like hours, and Karen's mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, each one worse than the last. Contempt of court. Jail time. Losing her kids. Her job. Everything unraveling because of one stupid whispered comment that wasn't even supposed to be heard. She'd grown up in South Memphis, the daughter of a factory worker and a nurse's aide, in a neighborhood where people learned early that the system wasn't built for them, that judges and cops and anyone with power couldn't be trusted to see you as human first. Her mother had warned her 1,000 times, "Baby, when you're in that courtroom, you smile, you say yes sir, no sir, and you keep your mouth shut. They're looking for any reason to come down on people like us." And now, at 42 years old, with 3 kids depending on her, Karen had just done the one thing her mother had warned her never to do. Judge Judith Martinez, on the other hand, had a very different story. She'd grown up in a working-class Puerto Rican family in the Bronx, the youngest of 5 children, sleeping 3 to a room in a cramped apartment where her father worked double shifts as a building superintendent and her mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. She'd seen her older brother arrested at 15 for a crime he didn't commit, watched him spend 6 months in juvenile detention because they couldn't afford a decent lawyer, and that experience had planted a seed in her mind that eventually grew into a law degree from CUNY and a relentless drive to make the system work better, even if it was just one case at a time. But somewhere between that idealistic young law student and the woman in the black robe today, something had hardened. 23 years of listening to excuses, of watching people make the same mistakes over and over, of seeing real victims hurt by people's carelessness, had built walls around her empathy. She'd started wearing her strictness like armor, using her sharp tongue to cut through what she saw as manipulation, believing that tough love was the only kind of love that actually helped people change. What defendants saw as cruelty, she saw as accountability. What they experienced as condescension, she believed was education. And now, sitting on that bench, hearing herself called crazy by a woman who just admitted to a pattern of breaking traffic laws, she felt something old and familiar rising in her chest, the instinct to come down hard, to make an example, to show that disrespect had consequences. Marcus Chen, meanwhile, was mentally calculating how to salvage this disaster, running through every piece of courtroom procedure he'd learned in law school and finding nothing that covered client insults judge over hot mic. Angela's fingers had stopped moving across her stenography machine, frozen mid-word, because in 30 years of court reporting she transcribed thousands of arguments, confessions, and emotional outbursts, but she'd never recorded a defendant accidentally broadcasting their own contempt through the court's sound system. Her eyes flicked from Karen to the judge and back again, and she found herself holding her breath, waiting to see if Judge Martinez would explode or if this moment would somehow pass into the realm of things everyone pretended didn't happen. But the look on the judge's face said this wasn't going to be one of those moments. Bailiff Thompson had instinctively shifted his weight forward, his hand moving slightly closer to his belt, not because he expected violence but because 20 years of law enforcement had trained him to prepare for anything when a situation went sideways this fast. In the gallery, a teenage boy pulled out his phone and started recording, an instinct born from a generation that documented everything, and though cameras weren't technically allowed in traffic court, no one moved to stop him because everyone seemed paralyzed by the sheer awkwardness of what was unfolding. Karen's face had gone through a progression of expressions in the span of 10 seconds, confusion first, then dawning horror as she registered everyone's reactions, then a desperate attempt to look innocent that only made things worse, and finally a kind of resigned terror as she understood there was no taking it back, no pretending it hadn't happened, no escape from the consequences that were about to rain down on her. Her hands trembled so badly that her purse slipped off her lap and hit the floor with a thud that echoed through the silent courtroom, and when she bent to pick it up, Marcus grabbed her arm and hissed, "Don't move, don't say anything, let me handle this," but his voice had the quality of someone who knew there was nothing to handle, no argument to make, no procedure to follow that would fix what had just broken. The microphone at the defendant's table sat innocently on its small stand, a piece of technology doing exactly what it was designed to do, capturing sound and transmitting it, unaware that it had just destroyed whatever slim chance Karen had of walking out of this courtroom with her dignity intact. Judge Martinez finally moved, leaning back in her chair with a deliberateness that suggested she was giving herself time to think, time to decide how to respond to something that had never happened in her courtroom before. She could hold Karen in contempt, which was well within her power and arguably justified. She could increase the fine, add community service, make an example that would echo through every defendant who came through her court for months afterward. Or she could do something else, something that was beginning to form in her mind, something that surprised even her. The courtroom waited, the air thick with anticipation, everyone wondering if they were about to witness a judicial explosion or something they'd never seen before. Judge Martinez placed both hands flat on the bench in front of her, a gesture that made several people in the gallery flinch because it looked like the preamble to a verdict that would not be merciful. She looked at Karen with an intensity that made the younger woman want to disappear into the floor, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled, and somehow more frightening than if she'd been yelling. "Ms. Mitchell," she said, and the formality of the name hung in the air like a judgment already rendered, "I heard what you just said. Every word of it." Karen felt her knees go weak, and if she hadn't been gripping the edge of the table, she might have collapsed right there. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, probably to offer some kind of apology or explanation, but Judge Martinez held up one hand to silence him without even looking in his direction. "I want you to stand up straight and look at me when I'm talking to you," the judge continued, and Karen forced herself to straighten her spine, forced herself to meet those eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense she'd ever built. The judge removed her reading glasses completely now, setting them down with a precision that suggested she was removing a barrier between herself and the defendant, and what came next was so unexpected that it would be talked about in the courthouse for years. "You called me crazy," Judge Martinez said, her voice still eerily calm. "You said I don't understand anything. You suggested that I've never had to make hard choices, never struggled, never had to choose between necessities." She paused, and in that pause, something shifted in her expression, something that looked almost like recognition. "Tell me, Ms. Mitchell, and I want the truth, not what you think I want to hear. Why do you think I'm crazy? What about this proceeding makes you feel that I don't understand your situation?" The question landed like a bomb in the silent courtroom because judges didn't ask defendants to explain their insults. Judges didn't invite criticism. Judges didn't open themselves up to being challenged by people who just disrespected them. Karen's mouth opened and closed, words failing her completely, because this wasn't how it was supposed to go, and she had no script for what to say when a judge you just insulted asked you to elaborate on the insult as if your opinion actually mattered. Karen stood there, trembling, her mind completely blank because every instinct told her this was a trap, that anything she said would only make things worse, but the judge's eyes stayed fixed on her with an expression that seemed genuinely curious, almost patient, waiting for an answer that Karen didn't know how to give. Finally, with a voice that cracked on the first word, she said, I didn't mean. I shouldn't have." But Judge Martinez cut her off with a gentle shake of her head. "I didn't ask for an apology, Ms. Mitchell. I asked you a question. Why do you think I'm crazy?" The directness of it, the lack of anger in the judge's tone, somehow made it harder, not easier, and Karen felt tears starting to burn behind her eyes, but she blinked them back because she'd promised herself she wouldn't cry in this courtroom no matter what happened. "Because," Karen started, then stopped, then forced herself to continue, "because you're asking me to pay money I don't have. Because you looked at my file and saw traffic tickets but you didn't see the 3 jobs I lost because I couldn't afford to fix my car when it broke down. You didn't see my daughter's asthma attacks that made me speed to get her to the emergency room. You didn't see." Her voice broke completely now, "You didn't see that I'm trying so hard and it's never enough and people like you, people with power, you just see someone who broke the rules, not someone who's drowning." The words came out in a rush, unfiltered and raw, everything she'd been holding back for 6 months, for years, for her entire life of feeling invisible to a system that treated her like a case number instead of a person. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier somehow, and when Karen finally looked up at the judge's face, she saw something there she hadn't expected to see, tears. Judge Martinez took a slow, deliberate breath, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed, softened in a way that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward slightly, straining to hear. 27 years ago, she began, and the shift from present to past tense signaled that something important was coming. "I was sitting where you're sitting now, Ms. Mitchell. Not in this courtroom, but one very much like it. I was 29 years old, I had 2 kids, I just passed the bar exam, and I was trying to make it as a public defender while my husband worked construction. We had nothing. Less than nothing, actually, because we had debt. She paused, and the courtroom had gone so still that even the air conditioning seemed to quiet down. I got pulled over for an expired registration because I couldn't afford the $200 to renew it. The judge that day, Judge Harold Peterson, he looked at me the way I probably just looked at you. Like I was irresponsible. Like I was making excuses. Like my poverty was a character flaw instead of a circumstance. Marcus Dillon, a wealthy 38-year-old real estate mogul, owns 17 properties across New York and systematically targets rent-controlled tenants for eviction to maximize profits. When he faces Samuel Torres, a 67-year-old disabled Gulf War veteran, in Judge Judith Hartwell's housing court, Dillon expects a quick rubber stamp eviction. Judge Hartwell appears to be an unassuming, quiet housing court judge who knits between cases, someone Dillon's lawyer promised would be a pushover. During the trial, Torres's daughter Maria presents devastating evidence, emails showing Dillon specifically targeted her father with the subject line, Priority 1, disabled vet must go. When the evidence turns against him, Dillon arrogantly stands up and attempts to walk out mid-trial, dismissing the proceedings as beneath him. Judge Hartwell stops him with a contempt threat, forcing him to sit back down. She then systematically dismantles his operation, revealing he's displaced 43 families using fraudulent violations. She rules for Torres, awards $25,000 in damages, fines Dillon $50,000, orders an audit of all his evictions, and places a 12-month protective order preventing new evictions without court approval. Dillon's empire collapses within weeks. Torres keeps his home, proving that no one is above the law.